G'day, Dan here from Questioning Christianity. We just finished up a great conversation with Max Baker-Hytch, a bona fide Oxford philosopher on the case for God. And just wanted to let you know, as something of a disclaimer, given the distance from Australia to the UK, sometimes tech glitches means we don't get the best quality internet. So the following conversation, as rich and beneficial as it is for you, sometimes the video is a bit laggy and freezes. So we hope you enjoy the conversation and get a ton out of what Max had to bring. The audio's good. Apologies for the video. We'll try and do better next time.
Great.
Well, welcome to this next installment of our conversation series, where in this episode we have a bona fide Oxford philosopher who's going to give us a crash course on the case for God from natural theology. If you're new to our channel here at Questioning Christianity, we are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. And we love getting your feedback. So much so that when you send in questions, once a month we try and bring on someone who knows what they're talking about so that they can face down all of your hardest questions in various areas that have to do with God, the Bible, Jesus, or making sense of how the Christian story affects your own life. Now, for a long time, many thinking people who might be initially drawn to the Christian story because they like the teachings of Jesus or because of the light that it might shed on our human condition, nonetheless have stumbled over the evidence question, the question of truth. Can I really believe in God rationally? What is the evidence that God even exists? And what are the limits when it comes to the case for Christianity? Now, these are excellent questions. And since truth invites questioning, today we are going to be transporting ourselves digitally all the way back to my alma mater, Oxford University, as we welcome on Max Baker-Hytch to the channel. Welcome, Max. It's great to have you on.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be with you.
Now, Max, in addition, I guess, to your intellectual prowess, one of the things that I love about our friendship is our origin story, because it was many years ago where we met doing a week of events together with university students in some Welsh university. All I remember was it was freezing. And one of my highlights of that week was where you and I got to do an impromptu debate as teammates against a few of the people of the debating society, and just had an absolute blast doing that. So I absolutely love the origin story, mate. That was a ton of fun.
I have fond memories of that, Dan, and I'm pretty sure that we were voted as the winners, weren't we?
I can't remember, but surely let's just say that that's certainly the case. In fact, one of the things that really
Exactly.
makes you way more human, for anyone who's watching this and thinking, man, philosophers are a bit daunting, Max is very much warm-hearted, hospitable, and kind in every way. So much so that I think we'd known each other just a few days, and after this trip, Max and his wife let me bunk on their couch for a night or two before flying back to Brisbane. So super thankful for that and the years since of just being able to pick your brain whenever I've come across tricky questions that I haven't quite known how to answer. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Really looking forward to getting into this, Dan.
Cool. Well, let's chat a little bit about your background, because philosophy is something that people might be confused about somewhat. It might be a new area. What is it exactly that philosophers do, and how did you end up becoming a philosopher? Tell us a bit of your story.
Yeah, I really fell into philosophy. It was very unintentional. I went to university at the age of 19 after having a gap year, traveling to your wonderful country, Dan, as well as America. I really didn't know what I wanted to study, but my parents suggested I would enjoy philosophy. I went off to do my undergraduate studies at Exeter University, and truth be told, I really wasn't that interested in studying, and I wasn't even attending most of my lectures. At some point during my first year, I began to look seriously into the intellectual case for Christianity, and I pretty quickly got made aware of the fact that there was a serious kind of philosophical case for theism, for the existence of God. And at some point during that year, I actually decided to become a Christian. And so very quickly, I was sort of thrown into this whole world of apologetics, sort of the intellectual case for Christianity. And that led me to start reading Christian philosophers like Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga. And then in turn, that kind of led me to fall in love with philosophy as a whole. And I sort of suddenly woke up to, wow, this subject is exactly what I should be studying. And that actually worked out really well. And I started going to lectures for the first time properly. Um, so, yeah, in terms of what is it that philosophers do? So, yeah, I think the American philosopher Alvin Plantinga gave a definition of philosophy as, and slightly tongue in cheek, but he said that you could think of philosophy as thinking really hard. And I think in a way that brings out the fact that it is really quite difficult to come up with a definition of philosophy that improves on that. I do think we can say a little bit more. So philosophy, at least, and especially the kind of philosophy that I am trained in, and that I was trained in when I was doing my PhD, and that I still kind of practice when I'm writing articles and book chapters and things like that, which is known as analytic philosophy, puts a very high premium on the use of logic and tools of analysis and so on to sort of pick apart arguments. And so I think, so philosophy, at least in that tradition, tries to study arguments really closely to see whether they contain flaws, sort of uses things like thought experiments and analogies, analyzing concepts, trying to come up with really precise definitions of terms, and all of that basically in order to try to answer questions that can't be settled just through the empirical methods of science. So, for example, the question, what is knowledge? Or the question, is it morally wrong to lie in order to save someone's life? Those would be examples of philosophical questions that we would try to answer through those sorts of methods.
So interesting. That sort of desire to look introspectively into what we think, even our deepest beliefs, and to scrutinize them to see whether they really are worth believing. And part of why I chose maybe for the tagline for Christianity, this truth invites questioning, really bases itself off that our beliefs, if they're really worth holding on to, should be able to be tested and investigated in the open light of reason. So I really appreciate that's what you do as a philosopher. I imagine, though, that there might be a number of people listening to this, both believers and doubters alike, who are under the impression that when it comes to religious belief, that's really on the opposite side of the spectrum to reason as a whole. That science and God, reason and revelation, that these are different parts of making sense of the world. And certainly I'm reminded of Tertullian, one of the early church fathers' famous quote where he asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? This kind of thought that Athens, this center of thinking and reason of the ancient Greeks, and then Jerusalem, the center of revelation and light from above, from God. How do these two worlds really fit together? So I'm interested in you answering this question. What do you make of Tertullian's quote? Or are faith and reason completely separate spaces when it comes to Christianity?
Yeah. So on the whole, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? I think one thing they have to do with each other that's really important is Jerusalem and Athens both care about truth. And that's not something that all intellectual traditions necessarily care about in that way. And in terms of thinking that there is an objective truth and that there is a way to find it. Though there may be differences in terms of kind of how that truth is disclosed to us. So I think that's an important point to start with. So when I look at the New Testament, something that stands out is that Paul, the ancient Greek schools of thought, some of the ancient Greek kind of philosophical schools, and that doesn't mean he kind of affirmed them or agreed with them, but he certainly took them seriously enough that there's all sorts of kind of subtle and less subtle ways in which he is kind of interacting with the thought world of these Greek philosophies. And in Acts 17, he goes to address some of the Greek philosophers in the Areopagus, this very elite kind of setting in Athens, in which, you know, some of the top intellectuals would be gathered, and they were there to give Paul a hearing. And again, it's not that Paul's sort of just uncritically affirming their worldviews, but he certainly gives them the dignity of showing that he understands their systems of thought, and also he actually kind of tries to find some points of contact with their worldviews, but then he sort of builds upon those points of contact in order to expound the Christian message. So that doesn't, to me, suggest an approach that is completely dismissive of the value of philosophy. And a final thing I want to say about this is that just because we might employ our rational faculties to try and evaluate truth claims, it doesn't follow that we are able to reason our way to God, as if God's self-disclosure isn't needed. Because, you know, and we'll talk about this shortly, but if it's true that we can sort of formulate arguments for the existence of God, that's only because, you know, God has created a world that bears hallmarks of his creative activity. So it's not the case that we're just sort of bootstrapping our way up to knowledge of God without God needing to be involved, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get onto some of the sources of God making himself known through natural theology, which is a little bit your wheelhouse, in just a moment. I'm interested to dig into this idea of the thought world of the New Testament, because a lot of people would rate Jesus of Nazareth as a great moral exemplar. But from the dialogues of Jesus that you read in the gospel stories, how do you rate Jesus as a thinker?
Well, yeah, the first thing I think I want to acknowledge about this question, which I think is a really good one, Dan, is that I think it feels a bit odd to Christians, including me, to evaluate Jesus in this way. I don't think we're used to doing it, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't. So, yeah, I want to say that there are several aspects of Jesus' teaching that are absolutely mind-blowing and revolutionary. So let me just mention a few. Um, and actually, on your point about Jesus as a moral exemplar, I think the thing about Jesus' teaching and the sort of intellectual content of it, and the way he behaved and acted towards people, they appear to have been extremely well integrated, which is, I think, something that we don't always see in the modern world when it comes to, you know, the idea that a philosopher can put forward their arguments, and that, you know, their arguments stand or fall as arguments, sort of irrespective of the character of the person who's putting them forward. And I'm not sure that is something that the ancients would have been as comfortable with as we are today. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. So yeah, in terms of Jesus' teaching, I mean, the idea that we should love not just our friends and family and our neighbors, but even our enemies, those who hate us, perhaps even people who want to kill us, that we should actually love them, is really quite unprecedented as far as I can tell. So, you know, love of one's neighbor is certainly there in the Old Testament. The so-called golden rule, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do to you. That's, you know, arguably that isn't completely unique to Jesus. But as far as I know, and, you know, I've tried to read around the New Testament scholarship on this, I don't know of anywhere else that one can find this really quite dramatic idea of loving one's enemies. Another thing in Jesus' teaching that is just actually really remarkable when you reflect on it is his ingenious answer to the sort of trick question that's posed to him by some of the, I think it's some of the Sadducees in Jerusalem, where they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And of course, what they're trying to do is, either way he answers is going to be bad for him. So if he says yes, then he's a stooge of the Romans, and you know, he's the enemy of the people of Israel. If he says no, then he's in trouble with the Romans because he's an insurrectionist. So they think that they've got him trapped, and his answer is both ingenious and brilliant as a response in the moment, but also in terms of the idea it communicates about human beings. So, the way he responds is that he asks for a coin, which of course has the image of Caesar, the emperor, on it, and then he says famously, "Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give unto God that which is God's." And it says that people were amazed, and rightly so, because what he's kind of saying there is that actually, yes, Caesar has a limited sphere of control, but contrary to the idea that Caesar is sort of lord over everything, actually Caesar's sphere is limited. And then as to the sphere of the human heart, who you are and whose image you bear, you belong to God. And so some have argued that actually in that saying of Jesus, you find kind of the germ of the idea of limited government, which of course is something that then comes into full fruition several centuries later. I think more generally as well, I'm just blown away by Jesus' understanding of the human condition. And so much of his teaching is about that tension between the self that we project through our outward actions and our deep sort of inner heart motivations, and about how we're just so prone to be deceived about our own motives, and just the way that there can be such a gap between the way we're trying to project ourselves outwardly and who we are kind of inwardly. And that seems to me to be a picture that really rings true. And one last point I'll make is I'm also just incredibly moved by his ability to hold together sort of moral law, moral correction, and kind of grace and forgiveness and
Wow.
And kindness. So he encounters all sorts of different people, basically social outcasts in many cases, and he shows them a kind of love that probably no one else has done. And yet he doesn't just kind of uncritically affirm everything about them. He doesn't just kind of turn a blind eye to aspects of their character that are harming them and others, but he just in each case finds this incredible way to love and embrace them, and yet kind of gently challenge and rebuke them.
Yeah. I actually have one of those first century denariuses with Caesar Tiberius's
Oh,
imprint
cool.
on it. That was a gift I think, from graduating my master's degree, but it sits in my office just to remind me both of the brilliance of the mind of Jesus, but particularly of that point to render unto God that which is God's, which is us, in whose image we're made. So totally resonate with a lot of what's being shared there. And maybe for people that are convinced that Christianity is unthinking, or that you're invited to check your brain at the door when it comes to belief in God or Christian worship, the New Testament hopefully dispels that rumor, whether the teaching of Jesus and his ability to just tear apart people's poor reasoning or argumentation, or the teaching of his apostles, as Max was sharing, just the way in the book of Acts they reason and debate and prove and try and convince and use persuasion based on the sort of evidence. So, Max, for those of you people who are listening and are new to philosophy, where would you send them to get a bit of an overview of the history of philosophy? Do you have any great resources to
Yeah.
get some of the major players and some of the major ideas and areas of study?
Yeah, a really nice book that gives you very bite-sized sort of introduction to the history of philosophy is a book by Nigel Warburton, who actually is the host of the Philosophy Bites podcast.
Cool.
And the book is called A Very Short History of Philosophy, I think. I think that's the title. It's something like that. But it's
Very
really
cool.
excellent.
Well, you're a bona fide philosopher in the sense that you've not only published numerous articles, which we'll touch on a chapter of yours in just a minute, but you're actually on the theology and philosophy faculty at Oxford University, where you're tutoring various subjects. So, as a philosopher who exists in a secular academy, even though many of these institutions once had maybe Christian underpinnings, I mean, Oxford itself, the motto being Dominus Illuminatio Mea, God is my light. Still, I think people are under the impression a little bit that the academy, particularly areas of philosophy, might be somewhat hostile towards belief in God. And I'm curious about your experience on that front. Would you say that the academy is hostile to belief in God, or would you say it's more open and honest in that way?
I think the reality is that it varies hugely from department to department and institution to institution. Um, so I've been around in Oxford for about 10 years now, the first 5 of them as a doctoral student, and then lecturing in the last 5 years. And I haven't really encountered any significant hostility to Christian belief. When I was an undergraduate elsewhere, I did experience a bit more hostility among some of my undergraduate philosophy lecturers. But yeah, I do think it's really quite a mixed picture. It's quite hard to generalize. I mean, one thing that's probably worth saying is that I think, and the survey data would back this up, that there are quite big disparities between sort of the proportion of Christians in, say, the natural sciences versus the social sciences and the humanities. So a friend of mine who works in the physics faculty at Oxford, he reports that maybe up to 20% of his colleagues are Christians. So that's really quite significant. Whereas in the social sciences, it would be unusual to find maybe even 1 or 2 Christians in a large social sciences faculty. And there's complex histories there involved in how those disciplines sort of have evolved, and it's sort of not straightforward to unpick why there might be those differences. As for philosophy, I think it's fair to say in the last 50, 60 years, there has been a big shift. There has been something of a renaissance of theism in philosophy. So according to a survey that was done by Phil Papers a few years ago, I think maybe 5, 6 years ago, around 15% of professional philosophers are theists, but that's high in the youngest generation of professional philosophers, sort of PhD, early career, that's more like 20%. So that is a very significant shift from several decades ago when, it would be pretty unheard of to find many Christians in mainstream philosophy departments. The atheist philosopher Quentin Smith said in an article in the journal Philo about 10, 15 years ago that he noted that the significant proportion of theist philosophers in the profession today, and he goes on to say, in philosophy it became almost overnight academically respectable to argue for theism, making philosophy a favoured field of entry for the most intelligent and talented theists entering academia. And then he finishes by saying that God is not dead in academia. He returned to life in the late 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments. Now that's interesting. Now Quentin Smith was an atheist, so he wasn't saying that he had become convinced by the philosophical case for theism, but I think what he is acknowledging is that there has been a sea change such that one can be a professional philosopher and be taken seriously and get a hearing in terms of the intellectual, the philosophical case for God.
Well, that's really good to hear. I guess for anyone who's watching this and thinking, "Man, can I get involved in this in a serious way and believe in God?" And certainly my experience similarly in visiting different places and speaking with people who are in different faculties around the world is they are remarkably warmed, I guess, by the openness with which their colleagues listen to their arguments or their ideas and have conversations around the table. So it's really encouraging to hear. Well, let's maybe hone in a little bit then on something that might have been a catalyst for that sea change, as you describe it, in more of a revival of the case for God in natural theology. Now, you've spent a fair bit of time in this area, and in fact, from you have a forthcoming chapter in a book, the Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology, which is coming out sometime later this year. Still date to be determined, but something to watch out for. And your chapter specifically focused in on natural theology and religious belief. It's a brilliant chapter. It's a big survey, I guess, of the case for God and whether you think it's successful or not. But just for people who are still new to a lot of this terminology, could you describe what natural theology is?
Yeah, so there's a distinction that goes back several centuries between two fundamentally different ways of approaching the question of God and what God is like. And the distinction is drawn between natural theology and revealed theology. So revealed theology is a way of answering those questions about the existence and nature of God by appealing to sources of special revelation about God, scripture, religious tradition, and so on. And then there's this other way of approaching those questions, which deliberately tries to not appeal to those sources, not because you're saying that those sources aren't valid, but because you're just saying, what if we bracketed out scripture and tradition, and tried to think about whether there is a case for God that we can make without relying and invoking those things. And so that's basically what natural theology is. It's just trying to use ordinary kind of cognitive faculties that all human beings have access to, and ordinary tools of reasoning, in order to try and build arguments for both the existence of God and God's having various attributes.
Very cool. And we're going to dive into a bunch of those arguments in just a minute. In your chapter, you actually survey a range of families of arguments, is the terminology that you sort of use, that you draw from natural theology. I'm curious in having looked through those, and I'll let you survey them in a minute, which out of those would be your favorite argument for the existence of God and why?
Yeah, I'm gonna be annoying and say I don't really have a favorite. I think
That is annoying.
in the sense one, yeah, I know. No, there isn't one I'd say. I think that's the strongest. I think in terms of the one I find it currently most interesting, it's probably arguments from consciousness. That's to say, arguments from this really weird thing, which is subjective conscious experience. So yeah, but I think it really, the force of them is a cumulative thing. It's about the combined power of them rather than hanging it all on any one of them.
Okay, well, we'll test that a little bit, and as we lean in, because I certainly hear online in conversations with some friends that we have that don't believe in God, it's relatively common to hear, not necessarily from sophisticated atheists, but at a street level, people make the claim that there is no evidence for God. So let's hear you respond to that statement as you spell out, maybe in layman's terms for us, what the case for God is according to these natural theology arguments. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just need to make one really pedantic point first about that claim, but it is an important one, which is that to say there is no evidence at all is a really, really strong claim, and no kind of philosophical atheist would make that claim because actually, for there to be evidence for something is a really low bar. Like, so that there is evidence in the world that there's a God who loves cheese and nothing else, right? Because that there exists such a thing as cheese, and the cheese deity would want to create cheese, right? Now, so there is, albeit a very tiny and weak amount of evidence for the cheese deity, which is counterbalanced by all sorts of other evidence. So on balance, it's completely irrational to believe in the cheese deity, but there is a little bit of evidence. You see what I mean? So to say that there is no evidence is an unsupportable claim. Okay, so having made that pedantic point, in terms of the range of arguments for theism, I think a point I want to make first is that actually in philosophy, when you look across all of the different debates, the debates in metaphysics, which is that branch of philosophy that thinks about things like the nature of time, causation, possibility, and necessity. When you look at all of those debates, and you try and find a view, a position on one of those debates that sort of has complete sort of supremacy in terms of a range of arguments that have, that are just unquestionably successful, there are no such views in philosophy, right? So I think that's an important preliminary point to make, is that some philosophers will say things like, well, we know that none of the arguments for God are successful, and sort of in a very sweeping way. But and something I want to say in response is, well, show me a position in philosophy about any topic that is such that everyone agrees the arguments for it are successful, because I've yet to hear of it. Now, then something I want to say is that actually, in terms of the range of arguments for the existence of God, the number of arguments that can be put forward, and the very different types of evidence that they draw on, I don't think there's anything else I know of in philosophy that can have such that you can build a cumulative case that's so wide-ranging in this way. So let me just really briefly, and you might want to cut me off, Dan, in case I start going on too long.
This has been the perfect philosopher's start, is sort of 4 clarifications, but then we actually get to the case. Here we go.
Well, let me try and, okay, so in the chapter that you mentioned, I basically try and group the different arguments for God's existence into 8 categories. Now, traditionally, there have been 3 categories of arguments for God's existence that have often been mentioned in sort of textbooks, and that grouping goes back to Immanuel Kant. And I would recognize those 3 categories, but I want to say there are several more. So the 3 that Kant recognized were, firstly, ontological arguments. So these are sort of arguments from first principles, that try to argue from the very nature of perfection, the concept of perfection. These arguments will try to argue that there has to be a maximally perfect being, and there's a number of versions of that argument that are under consideration today. And some of the more obvious weaknesses in earlier versions have been kind of ironed out in ways that we could talk about. So then moving on to cosmological arguments, which are a family of arguments that start with some very general features of the universe that you wouldn't need any kind of special expertise to observe. So things like that there is such a thing as cause and effect, or that there is motion, or that there is change. And these arguments will basically try to argue that whatever the thing it is you're focusing on, whether it's change or motion or cause and effect, that thing needs to have had some sort of origin point, some sort of first cause. And that first cause is God. And then there are what we could call teleological or design arguments, which focus on some specific feature of the world, normally to do with some sort of pattern or structure that seems to be quite improbable, and which is favorable to the existence of life. The example that's getting a lot of airtime at the moment is the sort of so-called fine-tuning argument for God's existence, which argues that, stuff to do with the very fine balance of things like the strength of the force of gravity, and how improbable it is that it would have just the right force to yield a life-permitting universe. And then there's a category that I call historical experiential, which sort of encompasses the whole range of arguments from historical events or private experiences, but which are such that it seems like the best way to explain these experiences or events is as having been caused by God. And of course, the arguments for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection from the historical data around what happened to the tomb and the conviction that Jesus' disciples had that they saw him again, that would fall into that category. Then going on to a fifth category is what I call metaphysical explanatory arguments. So these are arguments from that basically say they have two steps. The first step says that we need to be realists, which is to say we need to think that there is some real entity out there that corresponds to our, for example, mathematical claims. So that we need to think that there really are mathematical entities out there in some sense. And then the second step is to say that the best explanation for that kind of metaphysical entity, be it mathematical truths or whatever it is that grounds claims about what's possible and necessary. And so the second step is saying that the existence of God is the best way to make sense of that kind of metaphysics. Then moving on to what I call axiological arguments, which are really, which is the family of arguments that includes what you might call moral arguments. So arguments that try to say, firstly, that we need to be realists about morality. That's to say, we should think that there really are such things as objective moral obligations. They're not just cultural constructs. They really are there, and they're not just a product of our societies and so on. And then the second step being to say that, again, that theism, the existence of God, is the best way to make sense of that. Then the seventh category is what I call noological arguments, after the Greek word nous, which means mind. So noological arguments. So this includes arguments from consciousness. For example, the argument that says that consciousness is irreducible to physical stuff, even if it's highly correlated with brain activity. That first-person subjective awareness is not a physical thing. And again, then the claim that that the existence of consciousness that's irreducible to physics is more at home, makes more sense in a theistic universe. And then a final category is what I call epistemological arguments, which are basically arguments that take some sort of skeptical challenge to our knowledge of the world or a certain aspect of the world, and argues that if God exists, then the skeptical problem dissolves. So it's an argument for example, skepticism about our ability to know mathematical truths or moral truths, where the idea would be that, well, if our minds have been shaped by physical processes that aren't ultimately aiming at truth in those domains, then why would we be able to know about those things? And then the argument is to say that, but if theism is true, then that problem kind of dissolves, because there is a mechanism by which God could ensure that human minds do come into alignment with those truths. So yeah, that is a ridiculously high level whistle stop tour of my way of thinking about the range of arguments for God's existence.
Mate, I love it. And I can imagine there's people listening to this who are running for a dictionary because there's a ton of new terminology wrapped up in there. But that's part of, I guess, the excitement of philosophy or any new field of study is realizing there are vast amounts that you can draw from. And there's maybe way more underneath it than you may have suspected within the Christian tradition of people thinking seriously about the God question and other theistic traditions as well. So we're going to do a deep dive in future episodes. I'm sure we'll have you back on for the case for and against with various arguments of these. But suffice to say, people can dig into your chapter when the book comes out, or can find a ton on these various families of arguments online. But I want to shift gears to ask you a pretty blunt question, having heard that survey. And the question is, what is the point of making the case for God? Because I can imagine kind of from two levels there might be different questions. For those who maybe are more skeptical of belief in God, I want to ask you, how successful do you think these arguments are? And for those who are skeptical of God's existence, do you feel like when they investigate these arguments to a deeper level that they should be persuaded to believe in God on the strength of the evidence? How might you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. So, in terms of whether these arguments are effective, I want to say that I have observed them to have had an effect in moving people to not to being Christians necessarily, but to becoming more open to the possibility of Christianity being true. And that was true in my own case, actually. I don't think anyone who has kind of engaged in natural theology has ever really claimed that natural theology is sufficient by itself to persuade someone of the truth of Christianity. I think that the way I would see its value is in terms of opening someone up to being receptive to the idea that there could be a God who might be interested in intervening in human history, which then, I think can lead people to be more open to considering the specific evidence for Christian claims about who Jesus was and Jesus' resurrection and so on. In terms of have I seen people be persuaded by particular philosophical arguments? So I've had conversations with a couple of philosophers, really kind of renowned top philosophers who are sort of atheist agnostic, but who have said that in particular the fine-tuning argument really gives them pause and is something that they take seriously and consider to have some force.
So interesting. If some people from more the believing side, some Christians, if they were reading their Bibles, might be wondering whether people can even respond to intellectual arguments. They might be reading passages like Romans chapter 1 or 1 Corinthians chapter 2, which read in a certain way might cast aspergus on the entire, I guess, endeavor of natural theology. So what might you say to people who say it's pointless to reason about God with people who are still exploring the God question because you can't argue people into belief?
Well, firstly, on the scriptural passages, so when Paul talks about empty philosophies, does he mean the kind of activity that is involved in doing what a modern philosopher would consider to be philosophy? And I think there's good reasons to think that Paul may well not be talking about the activity of using reason to analyze arguments closely and unpick fallacies and so on. And actually, I think Paul very much, in a sense, uses that kind of methodology himself. So I think it more likely that Paul is disparaging philosophy in the sense of a certain worldview that would have been presented with a certain rhetorical style, And I don't think that his, the aspersions he casts on that would necessarily apply to what you and I might understand philosophy to be. And as I said, in terms of the value of philosophy, I would be very clear that I don't think philosophical arguments are sufficient to move someone towards a position of Christian faith on their own. I think that they can be quite helpful in sort of causing someone's naturalistic worldview to become unsettled. And I think that is significant. But of course, I think that following Jesus is not just a matter of intellectually assenting to various propositions. It's also so much about our hopes and desires and our loves. So it's volitional. And so, of course, intellectual arguments on their own aren't going to be sufficient.
Super helpful, mate. For maybe someone who's considering philosophy, given your story and a bit of your journey, getting into being pushed by your parents to study this, but then being awakened to the case for God and becoming persuaded yourself that Jesus is worth believing. What wisdom might you give to someone who's just starting out in philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing I would say is don't be afraid of the idea that studying philosophy will, cause someone to lose their faith, or because, and I think that's often closely coupled with the idea that the vast majority of philosophers are atheists, and that philosophy, almost by its nature, is atheistic. I have heard people articulate that sort of fear, and what I would say is that that is actually not the case, and that I think getting plugged into the rich tradition of Christian philosophy, including contemporary Christian philosophy, just getting a sense of the deep kind of rigor of figures like Swinburne, Plantinga, and so on, and just kind of getting that sense that actually kind of exploring these questions without fear really is possible. I mean, in terms of maybe a couple of resources to suggest to people, I think there's a nice book called Christianity and Philosophy: Four Views. That's a nice book to have a look at. And another one, but this is a bit weightier, is by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, and it's called Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It also gives a really nice overview of the whole various areas of philosophy. So it's a nice introduction to the subject as a whole.
Yeah, I almost find it for me diving in a little bit as a layperson when it comes to philosophy, almost like sampling chocolates. There's just so much that you can explore. You never know which one to take first or where to start diving into the box. But Max, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of our QC Conversations series, particularly just to spotlight the case for God. And I know it's very elementary. It's just a sampler in that way. But you've done quite a bit of writing, particularly on the sort of hiddenness of God objections. So not just the case for God, but some of the major arguments against belief in God. So I'm sure we'll get you back on the channel really soon to do another episode, maybe on the hiddenness of God would be great.
Cool. Thanks, Dan. It's been great to be with you.
And if our audience want to get more in touch with some of your work, where might they go? Is there a website, or have you got some other articles out there, or maybe a place with academic papers?
Yeah, so the best place to find all my free downloadable versions of my academic publications is my academia.edu page. Actually the easiest way to find that is if you just Google my name, and it should come up in fairly close to the top of the results. And yeah.
Very helpful. And just, we always have our guests sort of close with this last one, is if anyone is themselves watching this and wondering whether Jesus is worth believing, the Christian story is worth believing, what would be your parting message?
Yeah, I think well, one thing I would say to people who are possibly kind of investigating Christianity and not sure if they can kind of muster up enough certainty, one thing I want to say there is actually it's okay to doubt, and I don't see doubt and Christian faith as incompatible. That's probably the topic of a whole other interview. But I think it is possible to follow Jesus and to not have all of the answers figured out. Um, and and I think the other thing I would say is I would just really encourage people to read the Gospels and in almost kind of just try and get acquainted with the personality of Jesus and see what you think of the personality of Jesus. Does that appeal to you?
Super helpful. Well, thanks so much, Max. It's been great to have you on.
Thank you, Dan.
And that's it for this episode of our QC Conversations. If you like what you hear, we encourage you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell on YouTube so you get all the notifications. In addition to these long form interviews, we also do short responses to kind of key questions that people ask. So check out our videos on the channel and go ahead over to social media and follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. Keep up with the conversation and feel free to send in any more questions you have through to the website so that we can tackle them in future episodes. But in the meantime, truth invites questioning. So thanks so much. We'll see you again. Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.